Well, last week we were covering how demonism was defeated in Ephesus as a result of Paul's ministry. You guys remember that there were exorcists who tried to come in and speak in the name of Jesus, and they got beat up by a man who had a demon because they did not have the authority that the Lord Jesus Christ had given the apostles and those who believed in him in order to cast out that demon. And that really shook up things in Ephesus, didn't it? They were taken back by that power. And it was such an impact on that culture that they took all of their books and magical documents that teach them how to cast spells and everything, and they take them into the middle of the street. And what did they do with them? Burned them. They said, we are done with this. We want to go in a different direction. And so the city of Ephesus was transformed by this. And so demonism and idolatry are interwoven in the scriptures in many ways. And we're going to see today the effect. What does the gospel reveal about idolatry? What does the gospel reveal about idolatry? Is that changing? Yeah, there it is. Good. What does the gospel reveal about idolatry? And Luke gives us here in this next passage sort of an update on Paul's itinerary. He's been in Ephesus for about 2.5 to 3 years. He's been teaching, and Luke gives us an indication that Paul's travel is about to change, and he does so in verse 21. If you can follow along with me there, verse 21. After these events, talking about the burning of the books, Paul resolved by the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and go to Jerusalem. After I've been there, he said, it's necessary for me to see Rome as well. And after sending to Macedonia 2 of those who assisted him, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while. And so Paul is going to be in just a few days or a few weeks heading back to Jerusalem. And we'll find out later towards the end of the fall that Paul never does make it back to Ephesus once he leaves. And from that point on, he heads towards Rome. But this is what it would have looked like whenever he was traveling. He would have went back up through Macedonia, Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, all of those cities before, and he would have made his way down to Corinth. And we understand that he was probably collecting charitable donations for the church back in Jerusalem that was undergoing a lot of poverty at this time. And so 2 Corinthians tells us that was Paul's agenda, was to go and to make a collection for the saints so that we're back in Jerusalem. But before then, it says that there was a disturbance that came up. Now, he was in Ephesus. Now, this is what Ephesus probably would have looked like back in that day. And it flourished as the capital of Asia Minor from 27 BC and became the second most important city in the Roman Empire after Rome. This is what it looks like today. Its strategic location at a harbor city made it a vital trade center between the East and the West. And the city reached its peak during the Roman era, or during the time Paul was there. They had a population of about 250,000 people. And I want to, let's see here, I want to read. Yeah. And the next thing was Artemis. They worshiped this deity named Artemis, and she was considered the guardian of this city. They were considered the guardian of the temple of Artemis. And because of what appeared to be breasts or bull testicles on Artemis's upper torso, scholars once believed that she was a fertility goddess. But recent discoveries revealed that these protrusions were actually ancient Hittite magical sacs, and that Artemis was actually a goddess of animals, of wildlife, and most importantly, midwifery. So what was the number one cause of a woman's death in the ancient world? It was a very important service that this idol provided for them. Was they believed that it helped wives get through. She was actually a virgin. She was actually a virgin goddess. So they're beginning to determine now. And so this is what she looked like. Now, All of this is going to be relevant as we get into the text, because another thing that they did every year on May 6th is they had something called the Artemisia Festival. Artemisia, that's the only way to say it, I guess, festival. And what it was an annual grand, so guys don't laugh at my pronunciation of that. All right, be nice. All right. Artemisia, that's it, right? Yeah. So it occurred on May 6th, and it was a week-long festival reflecting Artemis's role as the city's divine protector. And at the heart of this festival was something called the Pampa. And this Pampa was a ceremonial parade that they would take through the city, and priests, priestesses, city officials, and citizens carried sacred objects involving ceremonial, involving either prayers to the goddess or votive offerings to the goddess. And the high priest led these solemn prayers and rituals through the city, and everybody was involved, and they would carry Artemis on this wagon all through the city. They would take her down to the Adriatic Sea, which was some distance away from the main part of the city. They would ceremoniously wash this idol, showing the purity of this idol, showing how pure she was, because she was a virgin, come to find out. And then they would bring her back, and they would set her up in this temple, in this grand temple of Artemis. And this is what it looks like. Look at that. Look how grand that is. It's not very grand, is it? It's only one column is left, but this is what it did look like here. It measured, listen to this, it measured 425 feet long, and it was 225 feet wide, making it nearly twice the size of the Parthenon. And it was built with 127 Ionic columns, each standing 60 feet tall and 4 feet in diameter. It's how big it was in relationship to a football field. Huge building, all those columns. It was said that the temple required an estimated 50,000 cubic meters of marble to make this thing. And they demonstrated very advanced engineering techniques, because the architrave, which is that horizontal bar that goes across the top of the columns there, it was one piece and it weighed up to 24 tons. They still don't know how they got it up there. It was on 60 foot high on top of these pillars. It's amazing, this. And more importantly than the physical size of this temple was its economic significance. And I think that is the key to our passage today. Perhaps nothing is more profound than the economic impact that it had on Ephesus and Asia at large. It drew thousands of pilgrims and traders from across the Greco-Roman world each year, and most especially during that Pampa festival where they were taking people through the city. It's pretty interesting because it acted as a de facto bank, offering deposits and lending services to people. And because of the sacred nature of the temple, and because it was basically made out of solid stone, it served as a secure repository for all kinds of funds and valuables from wealthy citizens, merchants, and even foreign governments would store money there. And so with all these deposits, made it very rich. Inscriptions from Paul's day show that temple priests managed these deposits, and they issued loans charging interest rates of around 12% for agricultural type of loans and up to about 18% for like merchant loans. And they used this wealth that was accumulated to build public infrastructure like roads and buildings and other urban projects, and also other types of memorials for like Caesar and Hadrian and all the different Caesars that came after that. It owned vast tracts of land around Asia, and these tracts of land was leased out for agricultural purposes. So that provided another stream of revenue coming in addition to the sanctuary money, in order to fund everything. So this thing was a money cow. And this is the streets of what it does look like and what it could have looked like. Isn't that pretty neat there? That's what it would look like there. And so that kind of gives us sort of a background of the city and how important this industry was. That kind of gives us a little context to our next passage. We're going to begin in verse 23. About that time, there was a major disturbance about the way. For a person named Demetrius, a silversmith who made silver shrines of Artemis, provided a great deal of business for the craftsmen. Now, these craftsmen was the economic engine of this temple. And merchants like Demetrius benefited from the influx of worshipers that would come to these different festivals, and because it was a crossroads in the city, and they would craft these small replicas of the temple and of the goddess themselves, the goddess Artemis herself. And this is what she kind of looked like. This was one expression of her. And these shrines and these figurines also served as souvenirs for those who were visiting Ephesus, commemorating their pilgrimage to the city. Verse 25. When he had assembled them, as well as the workers engaged in this type of business, he said, "Men, you know that our prosperity is derived from this business." That construction can also be translated that, "Men, you know that we have an easy living from this business." That's another way to translate that. And so this was a threat to them. You see and hear, not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this man Paul has persuaded and misled a considerable number of people by saying that gods made by hands are not gods. Not only do we run a risk that our business may be discredited, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis may be despised, and her magnificence come to the verge of ruin, the very one of all Asia and the world worship. Now, isn't that interesting that this big, powerful temple, that this big, powerful goddess who has all of this power is threatened by one man coming into a city and saying, gods made without hands are not gods. Isn't that interesting? That there's such a threat to that. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Verse 28. When they heard this, they were filled with rage and began to cry out, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." And so the city was filled with confusion, and they rushed all together into the amphitheater, dragging along Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians who were Paul's traveling companions. Now, this is what the amphitheater looks like today. This is a massive structure that could hold about 25,000 spectators. And it was used for performances and gladiator fights. And I think probably Michelle would appreciate this. Look at the stage that it had there. You can see how big it was in relationship to the man. That was way down there. And this, of course, is what it looked like before, and this is what they believe it looks like now, or back then. So, and look at how big it was in relationship to Wrigley Stadium. The Wrigley Stadium is not a small field, and that's how big it was. Verse 30. Although Paul wanted to go in before the people, the disciples did not let him. Even some of the provincial officials of Asia, who were his friends, sent word to him, pleading with him not to venture into the amphitheater. Some were shouting one thing and some another because the assembly was in confusion, and most of them didn't even know why they had come together. I think that's funny. I think Luke put that in there too. And you've seen groups like that. I remember the January 6th riot that we had at a lot of the people said we didn't really even know what was going on. We just sort of followed them forward, you know. And I think that's how riots happen. They just started yelling, well, something's wrong, and I want to be on the end of it, or whatever it is. Well, obviously the Jews everybody knew that Jews were monotheists, and so they wanted to go and kind of clear their name from this, and so they grabbed this poor soul named Alexander and pushed him up to the front, verse 33 tells us, and motioning with his hand, Alexander wanted to make his defense to the people. Basically, he wanted to separate himself as the Jews, from Paul's ministry, going, yeah, no, we're not it. But when they recognized that he was a Jew, they all shouted in unison for about 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of Ephesians." You know, can you imagine that going on for 2 hours? When the city clerk had calmed the crowd down, he said, "People of Ephesus, what person in there who doesn't know that the city of the Ephesians is the temple guardian of the great Artemis and of the image that fell from heaven?" So way back in their history, they believed that an image, probably a meteorite, fell down on the city, which was a not common event. And so they sort of made that sacred and said it was in the image of this Artemis. And they believed that that was somewhere in the temple, at least at some point. But that was their history, that it came from heaven. Verse 36. Therefore, since these things are undeniable, you must keep calm and not do anything rash. It's like everybody knows that the temple's here. Look at it. It's there. It is the most important building in all of Asia. Everybody's coming to it. Don't think that it's on its way out, is basically what he's saying there. Since these things are undeniable, you must keep calm and not do anything rash. For you have brought these men here who are not temple robbers or blasphemers of our goddess. So, of course, it would have been very difficult to rob that temple because it was guarded very well. But it was a crime to do that. And he's saying, look, they didn't rob the temple, and they're not blasphemers of our goddess. So if Demetrius and the craftsmen who are with him have a case against anyone, the courts are in session, and there are proconsuls. Let them bring charges against one another. We're not exactly sure why proconsuls. Usually it was only one proconsul that was during this part. But there is obviously a way in which multiple proconsuls could have acted during this period. Verse 39. But if you seek anything further, it must be decided in a legal assembly. In fact, we run a risk of being charged with rioting for what happened today, since there is no justification that we can give as a reason for this disturbance. And after saying this, he dismissed the assembly. Now, as we look at this passage, there are no imperatives in there. It's really just a descriptive passage. And so we have to sort of glean from it some principles about idolatry that we see here that the rest of the scriptures support and talk about. And I see three of them. And if you have your outline, you can follow along with this. The first one that I see is that the gospel reveals idols to be fragile. In the end, any idol that you and I elevate in our lives is at its core a very fragile thing. Think about it. Money. You remember the video that we watched of the money hole? The guy goes in there, he has this money, and then all of a sudden he finds himself in a situation where it would be very hard to enjoy that money. All of us, at one time or another, are going to leave everything here. It ultimately has no value in the end. Many of us, as we get older, we recognize that our youthfulness is very fragile. When we're young, we put a lot of emphasis on how strong and virile and intellectual we are. But as I've gotten older, I don't know about you guys, but I've noticed that that is a fragile thing to lean on. Your health, your beauty, it fades. Very few of us get handsome as we get older. It's a fragile thing. Your job, your career. In the end, those things are very fragile. And what happens is that the gospel comes and it reveals to you and me how fragile our lives are. The things that we depend on is fragile. We look at our economy right now with all of the tariffs that are going forward, and we see trillions of dollars that have been dumped out of the economy just in the last few days as a result of somebody announcing that we're going to have tariffs. Our idols are fragile in the end, and it's interesting how fragile these people's security was. I can't help but think of 1 Samuel chapter 5, verses 1 through 5, when Dagon, you guys remember Dagon, the god Dagon, the Philistine god Dagon, is that they had captured the ark, and they had brought it to the temple of Dagon, and they had put it in the ark, and after a couple of mishaps, Dagon, the god, found himself face down at the threshold of the Dagon temple with his hands what? Broken off. It's really a symbol of how fragile idols are. And the truth has a way of revealing how fragile our idols are. So I think that we see that here in this passage. The second thing that I see is that the gospel reveals idols to be futile. Futile. I love Jeremiah 10. The description he gives there. He says, like scarecrows in a cucumber patch, their idols cannot speak. They must be carried because they cannot walk. Do not fear them, for they can do no harm, and they can't do any good. They're absolutely worthless. They are futile. Romans, the third thing I want to see is that the gospel reveals idols to be false. The gospel reveals idols to be false. Romans chapter 1, verse 21 through 23 is probably our most familiar statement on this. And think about, read this anew for the first time again, perhaps. For though they knew God, they did not glorify him as God or show gratitude. Instead, their thinking became worthless, and their senseless hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. Well, how'd they do that? By exchanging the glory of an immortal God for images resembling mortal man, birds, four-footed animals, and reptiles. Therefore, God delivered them over in the desires of their hearts to sexual impurity, so that their bodies were degraded amongst themselves, and they exchanged the truth of God for a lie. There it is. There's the falsity of it. They exchanged the truth of our glorious God for a lie, and worshiped and served what has been created instead of the Creator, who is praised forever. Amen. Think about how blind you have to be to not recognize that this piece of rock that you just carved yourself is not a God that has control over your life. Whenever we give ourselves over to idolatry, we become blinded to the futility of it. We get blinded to the fragility of it. And we become blinded to the falsity of it. And that's exactly what happens with this entire culture. We have our own idols in our day. And all of them, ultimately, if there's anything that you have in your life or in my life that we place before God, if we are depending on any type of medication, marriage, material wealth, your children, if we were depending on anything above God, that is a fragile and futile and false thing. The gospel reveals idols to be fragile, futile, and false. Nothing special, nothing profound here. That's what this is revealing. And this culture is having to reveal this slowly over time. As the culture is exposed to the gospel, this is 2 to 3 years after Paul's ministry. You guys remember he was in the Tyrannus Hall and he had been teaching and everybody was hearing the gospel. People were seeing people get saved and demons cast out. That has a way of working its way into society, and that's what happened in Ephesus. But after the destruction of the temple by the Byzantines, Artemis's temple in AD 401 by Justinian the emperor, they ended up taking those pillars, those columns that were so grand, they got torn down, and those pillars now are in the Hagia Sophia in Turkey. But that temple is a ruin itself. I don't think Demetrius knew how prophetic his words were going to be, that this entire temple was going to come to ruin. That he could see maybe prophetically that this gospel had the potential to undermine their very existence as a culture. And during this period of time, the Christians tore down the temple and they distributed all of the columns to other different projects throughout the world at that time. And all the idols that you and I have today are also going to be destroyed. They're futile, they're fragile, and they're false. And one day, we and everything we own is going to go into the dust. So I ask us questions: what are we living for? What are we going to put our hope in? Because this is financially orientated, finances is very relevant for us as well. So what are some signs that perhaps money is an idol to us? Well, excessive debt accumulation to sustain lifestyles beyond your means might be a clue that money is an idol. Neglecting generosity in your life, biblical giving. All of that can be, if that's neglected and if it's sidelined for personal gain, that also could be a sign that money is an idol. Overworking at the expense of spiritual disciplines like prayer, worship, or community. There's a big movement within the church today saying, I don't have to go to church to be the church. You're right, you don't have to go to church to be the church, but you can't be the obedient church and not go to church. We need each other, and it's a slippery slope to where once the disciplines like prayer and worship begin to slide and being with other brothers and sisters, other spiritual disciplines that help us walk free from the influence of the flesh also begins to wane. Anxiety about finances dominating decisions rather than trust in God's provisions. We have to be careful for that as individuals and also for the church. The idolization of wealth, where career advancement or luxury becomes a primary life goal, eclipsing eternal values. I know a lot of students who are going to colleges today, there's a lot of pressure to succeed. There's a lot of pressure to pass the test. But I heard of a survey that said over 70 some odd % of students admit to cheating in college. And I'm sure there's many Christians in that involved as well, but whenever you say getting a good grade or being successful is more important than your character, that could be an idol. That could be an area in which the Lord is dealing with you on. So what would it look like if the gospel took root in our culture the way it did in Ephesus? Imagine Las Vegas, to where all of a sudden the gospel gets there and all of a sudden they make prostitution illegal. It's legal there. You guys know that, right? It's legal there. But they made it illegal. That they closed the casinos, all of the gambling halls, and all the who knows what happens there. What would it look like in our culture if the gospel was to overcome it? Consumerism, radical generosity and simplicity would challenge materialism for sure. That's what the effect of the gospel does. Radical generosity and a willingness and a desire to live simply. Did you know, and I don't know about you, I struggle with this as well, the pressure that we have that we feel to have more and more is really self-imposed. It's often a self-imposed desire to have more, but we can live very simply. And I remember being in the Middle East in Egypt, and I remember there when I was a soldier there and going and visiting Bedouins who were out and they lived in the bush. And in fact, many of them didn't even have a shelter that was permanent. They lived in tents. They had dirt floors. They did not have clean water. They would drink water that I would never even pour out on my sidewalk. And they were so happy. They were so happy. They had joy, real joy and delight, playing around and being thankful. It was really marvelous to see that as a young 18-year-old. Individualism also. Community-focused discipleship would counter this self-centered lifestyle of saying, I can be my own church, I can watch this church online, I can go and watch these people worship online, and I don't really need anybody else. Me and God's got a thing going because of the fact that I am in control of my own discipleship. You're deceived. Discipleship happens in community. Discipleship only matters whenever you're living life shoulder to shoulder with other brothers and sisters who are fallen and sinful as you, and you learn how to deal with your own sin and your own squabbles, and you're able to tolerate other people's sin and squabbles, and you're able to work through it and talk it out and get going and be in unity. That's what the real scriptural life is. Moral relativism. Biblical ethics would confront cultural norms on sexuality, justice, and human dignity. I'm all for the cultural elevation of justice in our land. That's a biblical term. But we don't want to turn it into something that's not. Power status, we could go on. I have a bunch of things listed here. Corporate greed, political idolatry, and celebrity worship would face a prophetic critique, I heard someone say. We give too much, we elevate some people too high. But God has a way of exposing emptiness in our lives with the gospel. He has a way of reviving authentic community in our lives. He has a way of using our suffering for the crises you and I face. He has a way of using them in a way that we can never understand. The gospel has a way of renewing our minds. How many of you seem, as you think about your own life, you seem like that was a foreign land in the way that you used to think because of what the gospel has done? Your desires have changed. Your inclinations have changed. Your goals have changed as a result of what the gospel has done in your life. That's the only thing that does that.